This is Cinema Field Guide, a podcast that surveys the breadth and depth of film history, one movement or micro-genre at a time. We're currently looking at New German cinema. I am Brian Loomis, joined by Felicia Maroney. How are you doing today, Felicia?
I'm great. It's cooled down, but we were having a wee bit of a weather chatter just before we hopped on to record. It's
Mm.
cooled down, but we're heading into the humid season here in Toronto, which I'm sure you obviously can relate to, but it's been good.
Mm-hmm. It's a Monday here, so just starting the week, but I'm doing some travel towards the end of the week here, so it's like squeezing all of my normal stuff into Monday and Tuesday, and then
Yeah.
traveling Wednesday through Friday for work stuff. So, gonna be long days, but I enjoy traveling. I like,
Yeah.
the flights, I usually can't do any work, so I'll like download a couple of movies and watch
I was gonna
them, and
ask.
yeah, so it's good. It's good movie watching time.
I always get in anytime I'm on a longer flight watching movies that I just normally wouldn't put on.
Mm,
So I'll be like,
yeah.
well, I guess I'll watch, whatever 17th Marvel movie has been out with zero context. I'm like, well, I have time. And this movie is like
Yeah.
2.5 hours long. So,
Do it while you have time. Do you use the seat back screen if
but
you have it
yeah.
available? Yeah, you're using the seat back screen. A lot of my flights, for whatever reason, don't have the seat back screen. And even if they do, like Hannah and I have a lot of streaming services anyway, so I might have access to something. The only time I would use it is if I can watch something earlier that's not yet on streaming. Maybe it's like
Mm,
$20 to rent, and I'm not going to pay $20. But if I can get it early, then I will watch it on the seat back. But that rarely happens where there's
I
something that
know.
I'm interested in enough to co-opt my whatever I have downloaded from Criterion on my phone. So,
Exactly. I mean, I feel that Air Canada, the airline here,
mhm.
the entertainment system has a Criterion channel. It doesn't have the whole Criterion channel, but it'll have like a few select movies. So I'll go through that first to see. And sometimes it's
Mm.
like, okay, finally I get to watch something I haven't, because I saw on a flight Black Girl for the first time because it had been on my
Oh,
list. And I was
yeah.
like, hey, here's the time. And then I went. I was like, okay, well, I have 6 more hours. So I guess I'll
Mhm.
watch
Watch whatever.
Avengers
Yeah.
7. Yeah.
Yeah, Black Girl is pretty snappy. That's a shorter run time, so you got time for the
Yes.
longer Marvels thing. No 30-minute set piece battle scenes in Black Girl to bloat out that runtime. So
No, no.
I I should share my horrific airline customer service story from this week.
Gosh, okay.
So, originally, I was going to fly into Memphis on Thursday and back out on Friday. Then I got another request, so I have to be in Louisiana on Wednesday, then drive. It's like a 5-hour drive, Louisiana up to Memphis, and just fly back. So I needed to
Mm,
cancel the flight there, but not the flight back. And I'd booked it as a round trip. I always, for work, book with trip insurance because stuff happens and
yeah.
going for like permitting hearings basically, and the hearings get canceled or moved around or whatever. So I had trip insurance, and the trip insurance just told me you have to cancel and we'll refund you, which doesn't do me any good because I need this Friday flight back, and there aren't as good options, and they're all very expensive being a week out. So I called Delta, and they said basically the same thing of, we can't just cancel one leg of the flight. We've got to cancel the whole thing
Uh,
and rebook you on Friday. To rebook you on Friday, it's going to be $250 more expensive just for that than it was for the round trip. I was like, You're not understanding.
Yeah.
I already have these tickets. I am already on this flight, and you're telling me that I need to pay more than I originally spent. I understand that the prices are more expensive now, but I already have the tickets and I had trip insurance and they wouldn't help me. So,
Yeah. Oh my
ooh,
god. I
yeah,
just feel
made,
like
yeah.
did you just not cancel the first one then?
I ended up doing it. I mean, it's for work, and so
Yeah.
it's not my money. So I
Yeah.
needed to be able to fly back on Friday. So they did knock $100 off of it. There was some like seat upgrade because the only seats that were available were like economy plus. So they were like, well, we'll knock off the upgrade to economy plus that we were going to make you pay for. It's like, okay, thanks, I guess. So
Thanks. Cool.
anyway, but travel
That's
plans
fun.
are finalized. I've got all of my stuff set, so I think I am all set to go for the rest of the week. But we are here and we're going to be talking about Young Törless today, which is directed by Volker Schlöndorff. So, you want to hit us up with a synopsis for this, Felicia?
Yeah, so Young Törless, directed by Volker Schlöndorff, and it's a film about an Austrian boys' boarding school in the early 1900s. Shy, intelligent Törless observes the sadistic behavior of his fellow students, doing nothing to help a victimized classmate until the torture goes too far. Sounds quite intense. And actually, the movie is intense, but
Yeah,
maybe a little
it's
bit more
not a
intense.
joke. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we'll start with a little bit of background on the film, director, how it came to be, etc. So, Volker Schlöndorff, very important director of New German cinema. Were you familiar much with his work before we started this project?
Not his name, but some of the films I definitely was familiar with, but hadn't seen. So, because quite a few of them, including this one, are Criterion releases, including Coup de Grace and The Tin Drum, which would be his probably most known film. And The Tin Drum had just been kind of murmuring in the background of films that I should probably finally watch. And I did for this series. It's an interesting film. I definitely prefer, personally, this one, but I think doing research on him, it was interesting because I feel like at some point I eventually would have come around to his work. He's just kind of like a little bit on the sidelines, a little bit kind of like Alexander Kluge from last week, where once you start expanding past the big three, then you eventually, he's the next step. But had you seen any of his work prior to this?
I had not. I think I was vaguely familiar with the Tin Drum, but really hadn't explored a lot beyond the big three in New German cinema. He would be, though, in terms of, especially at the time, he would be thought of sort of among those big directors of Wenders, Herzog, and Fassbinder, especially because of the Tin Drum, which got a lot of contemporaneous recognition, maybe the most recognition of any New German cinema film. It
Oh,
won the Palme d'Or, shared it with Apocalypse Now, and it also won the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film in that year. So very recognized at the time. I don't know that it or his other films like this or The Lost Honor of Katharina Bloom are as seen. I mean, by letterbox logs, you'd have to get past a good like 15 Fassbinder films to find, the films that are logged about as much as those ones. So I think it's getting to that point where, like, because Fassbinder has the name recognition, people are more willing to check out his stuff, even though at the time, like, the the Schlöndorff films that were recognized, those really the biggest three would be this one, Katharina Bloom, and The Tin Drum. Like, those were among the biggest and most important films from New German cinema at the time. Just not maybe historically recognized as much because he doesn't have the name recognition that those three do now.
Yeah. It's always interesting how that happens. And there might be a circle, might come full circle again where people start revisiting his work.
Absolutely. Well, can you tell us a little bit about his background before he made this film, which was his very first feature film, at least?
Hmm. So it was interesting to find out that as a teen, his family moved him and them to France. So he spent a good part of his teens and early 20s there, going to school, and then he apprenticed, sorry, in the 60s there and worked with like a lot of really big name French director Louis Malle, Alain René, Jean-Pierre Melville, working as, assistant directors on some really big films of theirs. And you can see the influence of French cinema, especially French New Wave cinema on his work, but especially this film. And to me, that's definitely why I gravitated towards it because of my love of French New Wave. But it feels very French with a German essence, which describes who he is. So to find that out made so much sense. He later on in his career was the chief executive for 5 years at one of the world's oldest film studios, which is really interesting to find out. So it's called Studio Babelsberg. And from what I know from reading him talk about it, um, the studio was in basically about to shut down. And he's like, we can't let this happen. This is like a studio that released a lot of like Fritz Lang's earliest work and a lot of like early German cinema. And it was like a really, really important. So he kind of heralded like a campaign to make sure it survived. So that's fantastic. He was also married to fellow filmmaker and collaborator Margarete von Trotta. And I feel like hopefully I'll get better as we when we eventually do one of her films at pronouncing her name. But she will return in this series.
Mhm.
Like I said, and like you've mentioned, he's definitely a name within the New German cinema era. And when you see the work that he did and all the work that he did alongside other directors to push the new German cinema, it's, I think to me, a little unfortunate that he's kind of a lost name, but a lot of his stuff is readily available, a little bit more than some of the other directors we're covering, I will say. So there is that.
Yeah. The availability on Criterion does, especially for these, there aren't a lot of other channels where their work would get featured or recognized in the same way. Now, some work has gotten physical release and such, but there's not a lot of, labels that are releasing a ton of new German cinema stuff, which is a shame, other than sort of the
Mhm.
big stuff, big directors. I think the thing working with those French directors, the three that he worked with, Louis Malle, Alain René, and Jean-Pierre Melville, they're among the best craftspeople, I'd say, of the French New
Mhm.
Wave. You've got other directors who have a lot of, energy or innovation or such, but they in particular really know their craft and their film history. And you can see that immediately in Schlendorf's stuff, that he has learned cinematic language and technique and how to use that effectively. Watching after something like Yesterday Girl, which is good and is using craft in interesting ways, but just the deep understanding of, okay, you do this shot and then this shot and then this shot to communicate this certain
Mhm.
type of thing. There's such a clear understanding of how to do that in Schlöndorff's work that I really like. So that definitely stood out on first watch and in his other work, like how much of a craftsman he is and how much he knows how to communicate things via film.
Yeah, it really feels like a more seasoned director making this, so the fact that this is his first feature directing on his own is kind of wild, and even watching, like you said, his other films, there's a very, like, astute attention to detail in the imagery and the way a frame is crafted, and like you said, if you're looking at a René film, that's what he is. That's all of his films are, like, down to every detail, perfectly placed, and you can feel that in this film, and I mean, when I watched it, definitely didn't realize that it was his first, so to come to find out, I was like, "Wow, that's a great way to kick off your career."
Yes. Absolutely. And so this is right at the outset of the new German cinema movement. It's released pretty much exactly around the same time as Yesterday Girl, maybe even slightly earlier. I saw some places that said 1965, some that said 1966. Yesterday Girl would be 1966. So it's unclear to me if this received curatorium money. Yesterday Girl seems to be the first film that received that, and if this was coming a little earlier, probably not, but he did get it funded and very much is in line. He's not one of the signatories of the Oberhausen Manifesto or really involved in that group of short film directors. He's more just coming from France and his experience there. But that connection with the French New Wave and what he is trying to do artistically is very similar to what the Oberhausen folks were trying to do as well. So I think he's very much in line with that, and then does end up working with Kluge later in Germany in Autumn. And so definitely is aligned with the movement as a whole, just comes from sort of a different strand at first, I think.
Yeah.
This film is based on a novel. It is from Robert Musil's 1906 novel, The Confusions of Young Törless, from our wonderful Thomas
Mhm.
Elsa Esser book that we both read to get background on new German cinema. I pulled a quote from it. Schlendorff's first film, Young Turles, was taken from Robert Musil's story, written in 1906, and shows the literary influence of Joyce and Proust. Schlendorff and his scriptwriter Herbert Asmodi simplified the complex temporal structure of the story and externalized the stream of conscious narrative into action scenes and set pieces. So there is definitely, this is a novel adaptation, and you can sort of feel that in the complexity of the story that's being dealt with here, but it really is a movie first. They made quite a bit of changes to the source material from what I saw to make this work as a movie that's much more based on dialogue and doesn't rely really heavily on narration or other things, where the book is very focused on Turles's inner life and thoughts. This externalizes a lot of that and is really trying to be a proper movie that uses the building blocks of what film can do versus the building blocks of what a novel can do.
Yeah, and I know he's known for doing a lot of novel adaptations, but I think what he does with this, as someone who hasn't read the novel but knows that there were a lot of updates, he definitely modernizes it, and we'll talk about it, but brings where Germany was at that point and where those kids would be at in their lives and modernized it quite a bit. So it feels fresh and it doesn't feel necessarily like something from 1906.
Okay, well, it's time to talk about the film itself now. We're going to highlight some traits or aspects that we think are unique or noteworthy. I wanted to just start, Felicia, by talking through each of these lead characters. So, if you haven't seen this or it's been a while, essentially you have two young boys, Beineberg and Writing, who are essentially torturing, raping this other young boy, Bassini, who they've caught stealing, and they're threatening to turn him in and essentially make him their slave. And Törless is our main character, and he is more of a somewhat passive observer. He doesn't partake in the torture, but he is around. He has knowledge of it. He speaks with Bassini at times, but ultimately does not intervene throughout the vast majority of the film in what's happening here. So that's sort of the basics. So and there's so much psychologically going on here that I sort of want to untangle some of that. So first of all, Bundaberg and Writing are a little more. I think they're the easiest to wrestle, and I honestly like wrestle a little bit with the actions of each of these characters and how we're supposed to feel and why they do the things that they do. And so I find that aspect of the film really fascinating and thorny. But Beineberg and Writing, why are they behaving this really heinous way in the film, I think. Do you get the sense for why they're doing this to Bassini?
I think I agree with you that they're the easiest, not necessarily the easiest to understand, but because they're so outright evil, in quotes, it's easier to be like, okay, I know they're the clear villains, as opposed to the other two characters who are a little bit more nuanced, especially Torless, which we'll get into. But these two, watching it and watching even just a lot of teen movies of maybe the time or novels that are dealing with a gathering of boys, ooh, and we might get into the fact that it's set like at an all boys boarding school, but these are two people who get off on power, and they will take whatever they can, however they can, and they seem to have 0 empathy,
Mhm.
and they're just clear sadists. And there's really nothing redeeming about them at all. And it's interesting that the film really doesn't try and make you empathize for them. Like right off the bat, they're shown off as being quite sadistic, and it's hard to watch children be that awful, especially to one another, and to the extent that they're being violent. It's very difficult to see that if they're able to do this at this age, how are they gonna move on from this? Because they are justifying to themselves every action, and they are not sorry for it. So you just feel a level of frustration. I feel even more frustrated by another character, but I think these two, you can just kind of like, they're not gonna. There's no redemption arc for these characters. At least to me, I never thought that the film was gonna try and turn it around and be like, oh, they're gonna apologize for their actions. These are two characters who are not sorry. At least that's how I read it.
Yeah. Another, I think, important aspect is that they're very much coming from a place of privilege. Bundaberg is
Mhm.
talking about what his plans are after graduating from this boarding school, and it's such a privilege. Oh, well, maybe I'll do this for a year, and maybe I'll just go like live and not work for a year, and all of this stuff. clearly coming from a place of wealth and privilege. I think that plays into, like, being so young and never having any needs that weren't immediately met, just seeing others who do have needs. If Bassini is running out of money, if Weinberg ran out of money, he'd have that money in a second probably. So
Mhm.
seeing people who are needy, there's so little empathy there of I'm in a place of privilege and power and I can do whatever I want. And there's this sort of learned quality of that through their youth and upbringing that I find really interesting as well. But yeah, very pretty straightforward, sadistic, evil characters in this film that are just upping the ante and making the torture worse because they are getting bored, which is really hard to
Yeah.
watch. Of just like, yeah, I'm sort of bored with this. Bassini's getting used to this way of torture, so let's take it further and further and further. How do you feel about Bassini as well? Because I think at first they do show you how he gets into this situation of lying about stealing money, being caught, not wanting to get turned in, and essentially expelled from the school. But then as time goes on, and Turles even asks him at some point, like, why are you still putting up to that? Like, where is the line where you'd say it is better to get expelled than to experience this anymore? So how do you feel about that portrayal? I don't see it as like a victim blaming sort of thing. I think it's more insightful about the psychology of someone who's experiencing something like this than I'd call it that, but wondering how you feel about it.
Yeah, side note, he reminded me a little bit of Piggy from Lord of the Flies, just the way
I can
the
see
boys
that.
go about him. I think the fact that he's having to steal money because he's running out of it is enough to tell you why he's putting up with this and why he doesn't want to be expelled. My guess is that maybe home life is even worse than this and he needs to stay at school. That's how I viewed it because as you're watching this film, especially for the first time, you're like, man, being kicked out of school cannot be worse than what you're going through because these kids, the next step is to kill you probably because they're never going to be satisfied with just torturing you. And the fact that he just wouldn't give himself up made me feel like there's something worse at home and there's got to be a reason why he doesn't want to go there. And it can't just be embarrassment of being expelled from school. I think there's something worse and maybe he's used to this and that makes it really that makes it really hard to watch just knowing that he's able to sustain so much and not that it doesn't phase him, but not as much as it might have another kid. And I just there's a darkness, an added layer of darkness to that for me, because I just feel like there's no way you would put up with that,
Yeah.
you know? I don't know. It's really sad.
Yeah, it is sad. There also might be a little bit of like a sunk cost thing going on of I've already experienced this much, and if I go tell people and get expelled, then it will have been for nothing. So I just need to, put up with it until we could graduate and then I can free myself from it. So I think he says
Yeah.
something somewhat to that extent when Turles confronts him about not going to the authorities. But then he also at times asks Turles for help. And I imagine
Mm.
that Turles is the one that you find the most frustrating here. So how do you I think that's the crux of the film is why is Turles not doing anything about this and what on earth is going on in this kid's mind? So, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, he's frustrating for sure, and has part of me feels bad also because I feel like there's a small amount of fear of stepping in for someone and putting herself on the line, but I think he knows that he's in better standing with Beineberg and writing that he wouldn't be in the same position as Bassini. So that's what makes it feels like frustrating because he could go to someone for help. And we see in this movie the adults aren't much help, but he could have gone to someone for it. But I just feel like standing by and actively watching something, even though you're not participating physically, to me, that's still participating in violent behavior. And I think it says a lot about the passive nature that was happening amongst a lot of Germans as the war was beginning. And you can see what Schlöndorff was trying to say with this character and how it's easy for us as viewers to be like, well, why wouldn't you do something about this? But also if you step into that person's shoes and be like, well, would you do something about it? And maybe yes, you would, but would you do something about it right away? Or how long would it take you to do something about it? Because he does eventually, but by then it's too late when he does it. So I think it's a fantastic way of saying things without explicitly saying things. I think Torless is a fascinating character, incredibly frustrating, but that's the point. And if you're not frustrated by this character, I would encourage you to rewatch it with maybe fresher eyes because there's a lot being said with this character, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a exploration of passivity as complicity, essentially. So looking at this boy who is really he's coming of age. He's trying to figure out how the world works, and I think very frustratingly sees this as an opportunity to learn how the world works, and his fascination with imaginary numbers and that there might be something beyond what you can comprehend, but it still is useful, sort of plays into this as well of like, I don't understand exactly what's going on in this situation or why these people are doing this, but I want to observe and learn from it. And that is the exact wrong way to approach this situation, to just observe and learn from it. He's like journaling about this and considering it as an ethical quandary without doing anything about it, which is completely antithetical to anything ethical, right? So yeah, it's very frustrating, and I think it's something that we see in Nazi Germany. It's something that we see today, and it's important to understand why people don't act when there is evil being done in the world that they could make a difference towards. And so it's a very difficult film, but I think it's not an easy film to watch. It's maybe the least easy film to watch of the ones that we chose for this series, but I think it is
Uh,
such an important topic to understand and explore for that reason of understanding why somebody would see something so heinous and not do it. And the film doesn't very cleanly answer that question. You know, the novel
mhm,
has more of Törless's inner life and his thoughts. The film is a little more elliptical about what he's thinking, but I think if you watch it carefully and you can I think the craft is strong enough that you can sort of feel it in your gut and your bones, even if intellectually you don't quite understand what it's going for or why Turles is acting the way he does. We know that people do act like this, and we don't need to understand this. We don't need an essay on why exactly people behave like this. We need to just see it and feel it and know that we can do something, we can choose to do something different essentially.
Yeah. I think again, it's not necessarily written out for you in this film, but to me, it feels a little bit more effective this way because I think watching something this that feels very realistic, like nothing about this doesn't feel like it couldn't happen. You would absolutely hope that it doesn't, but we know that violence happens
Yes.
within schools. It continues to happen within schools. And I think something like this has more of an effect than like at the end of a film having, writing come across the screen to be like, hey, you shouldn't do this, or speak up if you see evils. Like that's not going to work. To talk down to people. I think something like this that throws you in there and forces you to watch this unfiltered makes you think a lot harder about your own actions, let alone the actions of the past, as we wonder why people might have taken too long to speak up. Even in today's world, people taking too long or not wanting to speak up just yet. So, unfortunately, this film continues to be really relevant.
Hmm. Yeah. So it's set at a boarding school. How do you feel that the setting how and the use of the characters helps tell this story where you could tell a morality play like this in many different ways, but what does the setting contribute to this?
For me, it typically sets up that there is a higher economic status for a lot of these kids, for sure, to be in a boarding school and an all boys boarding school. So likely most of these people's parents are someone of, big status, or they have money or they have money. And we mentioned some of the characters talking about how they're pretty much set after they graduate. They just have to graduate and everything is going to be handed to them. But then we do see that there's characters who are struggling a bit. But I think the close knit nature of a boarding school where they're stuck there essentially for a certain amount of time. They're not around their parents, they're around adults, but most of the time they're around each other, like basically 24/7, which is not something that most of us have to deal with. We go to school and then you come home and then you don't see people on the weekends unless they're your friends. And then you're not with them 24/7. So this constant proximity of having a bunch of boys of this age together has to be very intense. And my partner, he didn't go to boarding school, but in Ireland, back in the day, it was still gendered, all boys, all girls. So he went to an all boys school. And some of the horror stories I hear from that are enough to kind of scare you off
Yeah.
of anything like that. So I think being stuck in such close proximity and having people like Binaberg and writing who are already people who this is not, I don't think this developed as they were at school. I think it was nurtured by being able to be like, I have earned my status here and I can now exert power because I think they're in their graduating year. So boarding school films, not all of them, but I find a lot of them are very intense and typically horror stories. I think a lot of boarding school movies, I think you could still tell the story if they had just gone to regular school, but it's a lot more effective with them being able to be like, there's nowhere for Bassini to run other than to an adult. So
Hmm.
he's stuck there.
But the adults, the
Yeah.
adults around them are also very unhelpful at best, and at worst are very authoritarian. And we see Turles get punished very early on, and the teachers are either doling out punishments or giving long-winded explanations around why kids just don't understand. And just
Mhm.
nothing about the adults in this film feels like they are any more mature than the students, though they certainly think of themselves as better. And that final scene as well, with the panel of teachers and adults who are interviewing Turles and trying, in theory, trying to figure out why he's run away after
Mhm.
Bassini has been publicly humiliated and tortured by the whole class, essentially. That scene, it's so clear to me that they're not really interested in getting to the bottom of what Turles experienced or knew, and they're just getting very frustrated with him for not being able to communicate clearly. And they're honestly grandstanding. They're trying to look good in front of each other in the way that they're asking these questions and communicating these things and setting themselves over as the authorities over these boys, and trying to find out who needs the punishment essentially from this whole situation. And that's not the right way to go about it. There's no real empathy or understanding there, just as there's no real empathy or understanding in the boys.
Yeah. It also feels like they're looking to blame anyone but themselves for not catching on to the fact that a boy was being tortured under their supervision. And, you know, if it was a different time and in more modern times, parents would be in there immediately asking, how is this happen and none of you saw this happening? It's not up to children to, you know, be making sure that other children are safe. So it just shows that's like you said, there's zero empathy from them, and they would much rather be like, well, now who do we need to punish in order to rectify this and just exert more violence instead of actually fixing the situation.
Well, I wanted to talk about the score in this. I usually don't think about scores so much in films, but I came across a really interesting article about this film as an adaptation and how the score is doing a lot of work in communicating the things that the novel does, just examining Turles's imagination, inner turmoil, confusion, etc. And it basically was making the argument that the score is the film's equivalent of making those arguments. Did the score stand out at all to you, and did it seem like it was communicating effectively how Turles was feeling throughout the film?
You know what? It wasn't until I saw your notes on this that it made sense. I don't think I personally noticed it too much. I think because I'm just so horrified by the imagery that I'm watching that
Yeah.
I didn't fully tune into the score, but I him saying this really makes sense. And it's kind of, at least to me, good that it didn't overpower the scenes and try and sway you in any other way. I am curious to hear
Yeah.
why you tuned into the score on this watch.
Yeah, it was mostly when I was doing the research. I think I did notice it, and as I was reading about it, I could sort of hear the score. And if I'm
Mhm.
remembering correctly, it's often at sort of transitional moments, so there's not a lot behind the dialogue. There's a lot of silence, which of course can work really well for a film like this when there's sort of action and dialogue going on. You just sort of use the score to transition between one or the other. It's an atonal score, which makes it sound uncomfortable and unsettling. Schlöndorff said he wanted the score to set an atmosphere of vastness and forsakenness. And I do feel that in the film. And I think even if folks don't notice the score while they're watching, it still does make you feel a certain way that contributes to how you feel about the film as a whole. And so it's working on scores often work on the unconscious. I think a good score often does not draw attention to itself and just adds to the mood of the movie. And this is a very moody movie, I think, in parts because of the score. It in Henze, the composer of this score, chose to use earlier period instruments like the hurdy-gurdy and the lute that don't do a lot of like vibrato or refined sounds. So very sort of crude, you might say, instruments, like early instruments to represent the boys' unrefined nature, how they haven't matured into adults. They're not fully formed people yet. So that was sort of his idea behind it. But then it is a very modern in terms of being atonal, so it's not, Renaissance music or whatever. It does feel very modern.
That's interesting. When I saw your notes about the lute, I was like, "Okay, wow, I totally missed that."
I
I'm gonna have to
couldn't
go
have told
back.
you that it was a hurdy-gurdy and a lute in the score either, but I did come across that in the notes and thought it was interesting as well.
No,
So,
that is. That's
mhm.
cool.
How about and I think this is a film that is trying to make viewers feel things unconsciously in a lot of ways rather than
Yep.
the Kluge film Yesterday Girl. It's just such an interesting contrast because they came out roughly around the same time. Kluge wants you to know like what's wrong with the economic miracle in Germany and walk away with some talking points. I think Schlendorf sort of wants you to walk away from this being like, what the heck is going on there? And why are these people? He wants to like get you thinking about it more. And so I think there are a lot of these things in the film that are implied or communicated in less clear ways or more evoked than explicitly laid out. And I think that that works well for the type of film that this is. One of those things is there are beyond, clearly the rape of Bassini, there are other homoerotic elements in the film, I would say, around Törless and his desire, perhaps, for his classmates. Those are, from what I understand, much more clearly communicated in the novel,
Mm.
but I would say still present here. Did you feel that much while watching, or was it more in the research that you came across this stuff?
I felt definitely a little bit of it, and actually a little fascinated to hear that the novel explored it more explicitly than the film. And my guess is because I didn't come across any interviews with Schlorendorf talking about that theme at all. Maybe he just decided to minimize it because there's already a lot going on in this film, and that's just like an added layer. But I definitely felt it in the fact that Torres is definitely a voyeur, and he's someone who he's still young and not fully developed mentally, physically, and he is probably a little confused as to why he's feeling these feelings. And I think that's where the voyeurism comes in, along with the him just being passive and not wanting to interject. But the way the camera frames him watching Vicini, I was like, I don't think it's just in the performance. I think it's something they must have discussed. And I think it was implied. I don't think it was by accident that we're reading into it like after the fact and putting our own reading onto it. I think it's there. And I think it would be a little bit more of a different film if it had been explicit. I think it's probably better off if it's the way it is now because I think that just adds too much to the film and opens up a lot more questions. And I don't know that Schlöndorff is well equipped to answer those questions, to be honest. Maybe he is, but I'm not
Mhm.
sure. But I definitely felt that there was a presence of that, of someone who is questioning his sexuality and probably doesn't even know really what his sexuality could possibly be at this point, but is in such a impressionable age where he is curious about it. And it's unfortunate what he is seeing is a very violent way of assault, and that's what he's watching. So it's very dark, but I it's to me it was there. I don't know if you saw it as you were watching it, or if it came about more in the research.
Was a little bit more in the research. I don't think it surprised me so much in the research. It was like oh yeah, I can see how that element is there. Essentially, so I actually have a passage from the book, but in the book it's pretty clear during the period when Törless and Bassini are alone at the boarding school over a break without the other two boys that they
Uh-huh.
do have sex. Basically, Bassini climbs naked into bed with Turles and proclaims his love for him. So the passage then at that point says, Then Turles stopped searching for words. The sensuality which had been gradually seeping into him from his isolated moments of despair had now reached its full extent. It lay naked beside him and covered his head with its soft black mantle, and it murmured sweet words of resignation onto his ear, and with its warm fingers it pushed away all questions and obligations as vain, and it whispered, In solitude everything is permitted. So that's not like implied,
No,
that's not
yeah.
implied
No.
homoeroticism there. That's very explicit. So,
Yes.
and there is a little bit of like the way, like you said, Turles looks at Bassini. I don't think Schlendorf is trying to remove that as a plot line here. I think his interest thematically lies a little bit elsewhere, particularly
Mhm.
because this was a novel that was written before the Nazis came to power, but he is a lot more interested in Turles's passivity because of basically grappling with Nazism. And so those are the themes of the book that he's really wanting to explore, but I wouldn't say he removes the homoerotic elements from the storyline. I think if you're watching carefully, you can sort of see that the
Uh-huh.
desire is there. But the desire is so confusing and would be so confusing for Turles because Beineberg and writing raping Bassini is not really about desire. It's much more about power and control. And so
Yep.
then having this actual desire for Bassini would be so confusing. And so that definitely like comes through and it's really complex.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're putting this on blind and you think it's just about boys being boys in a boarding school, you're gonna be fairly shocked about how
Mhm.
how deep it goes. Yeah, I think it's very gripping. As difficult as it is to watch, it's a very gripping film.
It is. And there more difficult films to watch. This is pretty clear
Mhm.
about what's happening in a lot of ways, but many times things are talked about or shown off screen. I think it's very respectful of these young actors and wants you to feel uncomfortable, but it isn't trying to be unwatchable for the sake
No.
of being unwatchable. It is trying to communicate something about this situation first and foremost. So it has to be very clear about the situation in that way, but it's relatively generous towards the audience because doesn't it doesn't hate its audience, I would say, where a lot of the films that might be dealing with similar subject matter might be doing so because they sort of hate their audience and want to put them through it. It's not really trying to do that necessarily. It has a reason why it's using this sort of material uh, to make its point.
Yeah, it's not a Gaspar Noé film, that's for sure.
No, no. He's one of the ones that, yeah, I would say is sort of hates his audience and is
Yeah,
trying
a little
to
bit,
just
yeah.
trying to make them feel bad as an exercise. And they're if he's got a ton of fans who are sort of into that, and it's the same thing with horror movies of if you like being scared, then
Yeah.
you might like being made uncomfortable. And we should, I think, be open to films allowing us to have all sorts of different experiences other than just being entertained. But I
Mhm.
personally don't really respond to films that are just like putting you through it just for the sake of it. But other people do,
Neither do
and
I.
that's okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat.
Okay. Well, let's get into this film's importance to the New German cinema movement itself in terms of hallmarks, how it pushes the movement forward at this very young stage for the movement, and this, what we're just talking about of covering uncomfortable subjects. This wasn't the only film that worked in that regard in New German cinema. Do you feel its influence in some of the other stuff that we watched?
Yeah, for sure. I think, I see we have Germany, Pale Mother
Yep,
listed there. I think most of her films, to be honest, are have to be influenced by this film, or at least she's seen it. And
that's Helmuth Sanders Brahms as the
yes,
director of Germany Pale Mother. Yep,
I I have to imagine just even the way something I didn't mention above, but as you were talking about how he makes films, especially this one where the message is very clear, but it's not trying to make the audience too uncomfortable. I think there's a dreaminess to the way the film is shot. Again, very influenced by the French New Wave, but even something like Germany Pale Mother, there's a dreaminess to it, which makes the images and the storyline feel even more effective because you're kind of pulled in to this dreamlike state of being, immersed in a world that feels so real and dark. But we see this even in a lot of Fassbinder's work. I wouldn't say all of it, but his stuff that is a lot more clearly messaged. Fassbinder can have a mean streak. My favorite one, even though it's an incredibly difficult to watch film, but Martha is has to be again influenced by this film. I can't imagine Fassbender not having seen this and taking a little bit of influence from the way he got the message across of how people's passivity can affect others near them, and in certain instances, like millions of other people. Again, even though this film isn't as spoken about today, I think it definitely at the time had a huge influence, especially being one of the first in the movement to come out.
Yeah. Yeah, they're definitely a series of films in New German cinema that are actively in this mode of covering really uncomfortable subjects, difficult for the viewer to watch, and really making you confront evil. And a lot of that stems from these being sort of the generation after the Nazis in Germany. You know, these are the artistic people who are wanting to confront this previous generation's actions and understand what it means for their nation. And so this, I think, is really the first stab at that in New German cinema, and it will get more explicit about grappling with Nazism and less metaphorical, particularly in the back half of New German cinema. But even the one we've already talked about, Aguirre, The Wrath of God, also grappling with that Nazism and confronting evil head on. Another film I saw, Hunting Scenes from Bavaria, is not quite as well known. It's also from the late 60s, but very much in the same mode of showing a lot of human cruelty, really making the viewer sit through it and watch all of these horrific things happen. There's a scene in the slaughterhouse that is just
Mhm.
horrifying. So if animal cruelty is a thing for people, like that's one of the roughest things I've sat through in terms of animal cruelty.
Oh gosh.
So yeah, it was pretty rough. But yeah, there's definitely, like, this kicks off a strand of movies who are dealing with this stuff. So I think it's an important part of the movement as a whole.
Yeah, and I do think it's like it is, the new German cinema movement coming about as a criticism of those post-war Heimat films, and I think this feels like a direct criticism of those films that were just really not wanting to talk about what had happened in their country, and this takes it head on, and as we mentioned, is just a little bit more direct about how he's feeling, and I think the fact that he also spent time outside of Germany and in France allowed him to have a bit more introspection on maybe the people around him, his family, and the culture that he was immersed in. Once you're away from it, you can look back on it and be more direct in confronting your emotions, even if he didn't personally live through this, but it's still very much a part of the culture at that time, even today. But I think that distance allowed him to tackle it the way he did in this film. That's how I read it.
Mhm. The other aspect here of the grappling with Nazism and the Holocaust would be the depiction of Törless as this passive, complicit figure, and the relationship of that with the essentially the banality of evil, the famous Hannah Arendt description of sort of the Nazi regime of just following orders, even if they weren't actively cruel or
Mhm.
participants, they went along with things that were horrific. So, did you feel that in this film?
Very much kind of what we've been saying, that it's even if the film doesn't explicitly mention those words, that part of the German culture, it's difficult for you to not read that, as you're watching it. And it's not even necessarily just about German history, because there's many people, many countries and parts of history that have dealt with similar horrific, experiences where a lot of members of the communities were just being like, if it's not affecting me, I'm not going to put my neck out on the line until I need to. There's a pretty good quote that I found from Schlöndorff where he says, as he's talking about the film, he says, all this is reminiscent of the Nazi regime, the practices of the takeover, Himmler's speeches, and the attitude of the enlightened bourgeoisie that only watched the primitive Nazis until it was too late. And I feel like that pretty much sums up the film without, again, it being explicitly about, you know, Nazis or that era of German history. If you know anything about this era of film, most of those directors were wanting to tackle it in one way or another. So it's again, I think common theme throughout the series will be the way the different directors tackle it because they all have their own ways of doing it. I definitely gravitated towards his way of tackling these these themes.
Yeah, I think it's a really strong one. And I think part of the strength of it as well comes from the fact that it's an adaptation of a, from all indications, really great novel. Neither of us have read it,
Mhm.
but German novels, unlike like we've been talking about German films at this time, were not very well thought of. They weren't thought of as important internationally, contemporaneously until new German cinema came along. So I think the adaptation of novels becomes very important to New German cinema in terms of establishing its respectability, because there are many German novels at the time and in the first half of the 20th century are among the most critically acclaimed. You've got Thomas Mann, Heinrich Böll, Günter Grass, and Musil, who wrote this film. Most of those authors are adapted by New German Cinema directors. And then, not in Germany, but in German language, you've also got Franz Kafka, who I'm sure people would be familiar with as well. So,
Uh-huh.
German is like a language where a lot of great literature is being written. And so, the ability to sort of take that art form that is more established and is doing some of the things that the new German cinema directors want to be doing with their medium, it is a good way to launch their movement, essentially, to say we're more aligned with these novels than the films that have come in the decade prior.
Yeah. I think it definitely helps having a built-in audience, as you said,
But yeah.
who would be, even if they haven't read it, maybe they're at least familiar with the title, what the novel is about, and those novels being translated to other languages too and being read outside of Germany helps as well. Because even in the research that I was doing, the book seems to be still widely read because there was a lot of literature about this book I came across as I was doing research. And this is a book I personally had never heard about before, but obviously has still, you know, presence. So
Mhm.
I am interested to read it at some point.
Yeah. I saw a lot of the contemporary criticism around this film was that it was not a very faithful novel adaptation, which really drives me crazy as a criticism of the movie, of a movie. It might be fair in this case, having not read the novel, like maybe the novel's doing things that are really, really excellent. But I think this is a very strong film, and I don't think that a film needs to be faithful to its source material. It doesn't owe the source material anything. It should be the best film that it can be, and you are working in a different medium, and so you need to be able to do different things. And from what I've read about this book, being a lot about Törless's imagination, his inner thought life, really exploring the way he is thinking and processing things. Like there's just not, you know, you could make a movie that was a lot more heavy on narration, and I think that movie would probably be worse than what we have here, which
Oh,
I think is a very strong film. A lot of the action's been externalized. We're dealing with maybe a shift in thematic emphasis versus what the novel was doing, but there's no reason you can't do that. You can take the bones of a story and apply it to something else. So I don't have a problem with like a lack of faithfulness, even if it is like a classic novel necessarily. Though I do, the novel sounds really compelling as well, and is also something I'd be interested, like you, in reading. So
yeah. I don't think a film should ever aim to put page to, celluloid directly. That's never gonna make for a good film. And I
uh,
think the best part about it is the film is that we don't have that much insight into Torles's mind. Because
mhm.
if you know too much, if he's telling you this is why I'm thinking this and that, it's less effective, and it doesn't allow for the audience to try and decipher why someone might do something like this or not do anything at all. So I think this is the better way about going about it.
Yeah, absolutely. The not knowing why he is behaving the way he is behaving sort of makes you just dwell on it, and it sits with you for after you've finished watching the film. And for the purpose that this film is really trying to grapple with passive observation of evil and why people don't take action to stop evil happening, like that is the perfect thing for the viewer to be sitting with. Not as important perhaps to the novel, but very important to what the film's doing.
Mhm. I agree.
Okay, well, we talked about Schlöndorff a little bit, and I think mentioned many of the films that people might be familiar with. He's made a lot of films, only really a handful that I was compelled to check out. There seemed to be some duds in there, but some seemed somewhat interesting as well. So how do you think this fits into his broader filmography, and are there any others that you would recommend?
I think this is definitely the place to start because I think it really exemplifies who he is as a director, both thematically but visually, and you get that the direct influence of the French New Wave on this that still continues throughout his at least German career. He later goes to America, has a little brief stint, as a lot of European directors do. The only one out of the major three, because he did a film called Swan in Love, did win Death of a Salesman, which I'm sure a lot of people have seen, Dustin Hoffman, John Malkovich one, which I haven't seen, but I know a lot of people have, and The Handmaid's Tale, the first film adaptation, which I watched in high school. Obviously, I had
Mm.
no idea that he directed this, but the imagery from that film has stuck with me for a very long time, and doing research of watching his films and research on him, I can see a lot of his work on there, but I personally would recommend sticking with his German work. I'd say this one, Tin Drum, just because I think people should watch it and it's interesting. The Lost Honor of Katharina Bloom, I think it's a fascinating film. And more politically overt than this one is, for sure, and then Coup de Grâce is visually similar to this one. I liked it a lot, and I think that film specifically influenced The White Ribbon. It had to have influenced The White Ribbon.
Mhm.
So, if you're a fan of that film, not that that's a feel-good movie at all, but if you're in the
Yeah.
mood to watch something similar, and as you mentioned, he's still making work. His latest film just premiered at Cannes, and it'll be coming out for people to watch in October 2026. It's called the English title is called Visitation. I saw a lot of interviews with him talking about it, even recent ones when he was at the film festival and all of the images. It looks very interesting, so I'd be interested to watch it when it comes out for people. If it comes out
Yeah.
out here, we'll see, but I don't know.
I love that he and Herzog and vendors are still working, have released
I
films
know.
this decade. That's really fantastic to still have those active voices from this movement, even as we're recording this series, 60 years after the fact of this movie being released. So it's just sort of crazy.
Gosh, wow.
So yeah. Yeah, I think for me the highlight, I've only seen Lost Honor of Katharina Bloom and Tin Drum of his others. Lost Honor of Katharina Bloom is fantastic and certainly worth checking out. Very different, but really, really great. The Tin Drum is a little controversial because of some sex scenes with an adolescent boy involved. And so there's a little bit of ickiness involved in that. And it also just felt like a real, like, this is what you can see at an international art house festival every year sort of thing to me. Like,
Yeah,
if there are some moments that have like a distinct voice, but when you watch enough art house films, you get the sense for like, oh, this is doing that sort of thing. And you can see why it was recognized, why it did well at festivals and the
yeah,
Oscars and such. But in terms of having a distinctive voice, I didn't enjoy it as much as the other two that I've seen. So,
that's fair. And I was just laughing because it feels very much like that one European art house film that makes it out. And
hmm
sometimes a director's most popular film is not their best. So I think we're both in agreement. Again, an interesting enough film to check out, but I think that this one is a lot better.
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we've done enough talking about new German cinema. It is time for a double feature with this film that is not from the movement. What do you have for us today, Felicia?
Yep, kind of like last week, I went a little bit more on the nose and a little more obvious, but I think that this reminded me so much of the 400 Blows, the Truffaut film from 1959. As you've been mentioning throughout this episode, the influence on the French New Wave on Schlöndorff's career, and this film, I think you pairing it with the new wave, French New Wave film is definitely going to elevate the imagery, especially if you're in the mood to watch two black and white films and we can see the different ways the two cultures tackle troubled boys. 400 Blows is a sad enough film, but it's nowhere near as dark as this film is. So I would say watch it second so that you have something a
Mm,
little bit nicer to watch after Young Torless. Unless you want to end on a darker note, but I feel like I mean, the film doesn't end happy. Not to spoil 400 Blows, but
mm,
um, there's a lot more humor, I think, in the 400 Blows than there is in this one. And I'll recommend any Truffaut. It's not my favorite, but I think thematically they deal with similar things. I just don't think that Truffaut has like a nasty bone in his body. He would not be able to make a movie this dark. I don't think.
Probably not, but that's okay. We love him anyway.
That's okay. We
Yeah.
do. What do you got?
So I had gone after the movement for my first two double features. And so I wanted to go a little bit earlier for this one, but was having trouble really finding a good match because this is so dark and explicit. Earlier films don't necessarily aren't necessarily as frank as a whole about, you know, sex, torture, all of the stuff that's featured here, and so the darker tone was a hard thing to find a good fit for. But then, of course, I thought of our friend Louis Buñuel, who made many dark films over the course of his career. But the one I thought of was Los Olvidados, or The Young and the Damned, from 1950. An excellent film, one of his most known, most respected, made in Mexico. And I think the key difference here is that Los Olvidados is dealing with essentially kids in poverty versus kids from privilege, but similarly dealing with some of that cruelty, violence begets violence, the impossibility of exiting, from these sorts of situations, and how it has a similarly bleak ending to this film, and a lot of like turning the other way or not really wanting to confront evil or the world works and such. So it's a great film, and that was my double feature for this week. So only
Nice.
Buñuel could provide something that was
Yeah.
mean-spirited enough earlier than this film to be a good match.
I know. Once you mentioned that, I was like, you know what? That makes sense. He has a great balance in his films, but he does definitely have a mean streak. Within reason. I
I
don't think he
really
hates his
like,
audience.
yeah.
Yeah.
I really like Buñuel, and I do, like we were talking about with Fassbender, of like the big three.
Uh-huh.
He's the one, because he's the meanest. He is sort of the one
Yeah.
that I generally respond to the films the most. So I definitely think that style really works for me in general. So yeah, love
Nice.
Buñuel, and continues to do great work, through the 60s, through the 70s. So he's active around the time of this film, but Los Olvidados. Well, this has been Cinema Field Guide. Felicia, where can people find us?
On most main social platforms, we've got our Instagram, which is under the name Cinema Field Guide. We have our YouTube, Blue Sky, and Twitter, both under Cinema Field Guide, and our website, also Cinema Field Guide. Do a quick Google. I'm sure hopefully all those will come up fairly easily. Also created a link tree, so
Oh,
everything
very
will be
nice.
out there for you to just click one link and have all the links available for you. And then we also have an email, cinemafieldguide@gmail.com. Send us emails about anything, either the episodes, the movies we cover, movies we didn't cover, if you want to recommend us some movies, or just general movie chatter. I'm sure we'd be happy to talk about anything within within
Between the
reason. But
two of us, we've probably seen the movie that you want to talk about, but
yes,
not necessarily.
I know
There's
you might
some
try
movie.
this.
There's always more movies to see. There's always more to see.
Always.
Yeah.
There's always. That's the best. That's the beautiful part of life. It's
Mm-hmm.
never ending. So, yeah,
You
please
never run
send us a
out
follow.
Yeah, never run
But
out of movies to watch, and you never run out of interesting and even great movies to watch. There's a never-ending stream if you're open to it. So
exactly.
that's what we're all about here at Cinema Field Guide. Thanks for listening to the podcast, and we'll see you next week on Cinema Field Guide.